All right, let's go. This week's edition of That Change Show is about the change equation. So it's Sunday, November 13th, 2022. Finally getting back into a weekly rhythm of these episodes. The original intent was to do this live, kind of off the cuff podcast and video cast. So you can catch these at leanchange.tv for the video versions or on our YouTube channel, and obviously the audio versions in your favorite podcast listening thingamajigger. And I wanted to take input from change agents, from lean coffees that I host, and events and training sessions and things like that, and do a live off the cuff episode about what people can do to kind of move past some of these problems that they're running into in the real world. And this one's all about the change equation. So the funny thing with the change equation, it's kind of similar to the quote unquote 70% stat that I got dragged into, and the change management is dead conversation that I got dragged into a number of years ago on Twitter as well. I always get these comments around, if people don't agree with a piece of content that's being posted from somewhere, then they go, oh my God, I can't believe somebody said that. I wonder what Jason thinks. And they drag me into it. And then, of course, I get yelled at for putting my opinion on it, too. And I think the interesting thing about that is I think the perspective. So before I got into recording this episode, I went back and I looked at the post about that I wrote back in 2015 about the change equation is wrong. So somebody had posted the article up on LinkedIn again, and every once in a while I see this change equation kind of float through social media, and it always gets hundreds and thousands of likes and things like that. People are like, yes, that's so true, that's so awesome. And I think the reason why some people value the perspective that I have is just the take that I have on these things. I think that the change world is so latched onto oversimplified ideas that just make people feel good, because doing change work, it's freaking hard, man. Like, it can be, if you're by yourself and you're doing, people change or transformations or any of these complex changes, it gets really lonely. You're thinking about this thing 100% of the time. And no one else in the organization is thinking about it 100% of the time. It's, we forget that people have day jobs, right? So, they're trying to get software out the door, they're trying to get the new presentations done for clients or whatever it is. And you've got this annoying change agent that's coming to you with a template to fill out to try to move change forward. And they don't want to do it. They've got day jobs, right? They've got things going on. And I think it's kind of because I fell into the change world in a backwards way. So I came from a software development background and got into change probably in the, I guess you could say the late 90s or so, out of necessity. So one of the first changes that I worked on was in a call center, actually. And so I was answering phones, doing tech support, and we had these gigantic binders of procedure manuals. So this was a global call center, and people would call in and say, hey, I can't remember my voicemail password, or I can't do this or that or the other. So we'd have to log into the mainframe, and then we'd look up the codes in the binder, and we'd have to type these codes into the mainframe and then send off the call. And this was back in the day when, when you wanted to build a web application, you had to build it. You had to find parts for a server and put it together, and you had to install the operating system and the database and all this stuff. And me and a friend of mine just did this on the side. So we'd come in early for our shift, or we'd stay a little bit later, and we put all of that stuff online. And for the tech nerds that are out there listening to this, we used Windows NT 3.5, O'Reilly's Website Pro, and a Microsoft Access database as the back end. So when you talk about how would that normally happen in an organization today? Well, somebody would be dissatisfied with a bunch of binders. So they would engage the change team to run a change project to implement a system to do it. And that would take 5 years, and then nobody in the call center would want to use it because, number one, it would probably not be the right thing because nobody's going to listen to the people on the phones, right? We had some derogatory terms, let's just say, if you work at a call center, shouted against us numerous times. And so, getting into change that way, I think gave me a different perspective. So instead of thinking about how do we steamroll people with this method or this process, it became more about what's the problem, who has the problem, they probably know how to solve it, Let's help them figure out how to solve it. And then let's sort of deal with the organizational impact of that after the fact. Actually, a coach I worked with said, he said, your biggest problem, which think about that, right? I'm working with another coach and he starts a conversation with your biggest problem. So take that with a bit of a grain of salt. You go native, you want to protect the teams. And, I think that's kind of true to a certain extent, but the whole intention was to try to figure out how to let the people who are right in front of this problem figure out how to solve it through change. And then as I kind of got out of IT and then into more software development and then into agile and agile coaching in the early 2000s, I think I dragged this one out, one of the first business books I read was Why Business People Speak Like Idiots. And I'll put the links in the show notes, and the links will be in the YouTube channel as well. And this was basically a bullshit guide that was, when business people say this bullshit, here's what they really mean. So here's how you cut through the nonsense to figure out what's really going on. And that's been my vibe for change. So, when I write these articles about the change equation being wrong or this, that, and the other, the people who enjoy it are non-change people. And the people who don't enjoy it are the people who are either, quote unquote change experts or thought leaders who maybe it's their idea or maybe it's something that they use to sell their services and their training and their products and stuff. There's no intention to do any of that kind of ill will. It's more, I think there's a responsibility when you get to a certain level that pushing these easy answers just isn't helpful. So what I'm going to do in this episode, that was a pretty long preamble, but what I'm going to do in this episode is break down my original thoughts of what the change equation was, take some of the input from the comments, and I'm not going to be able to go through everything because there's just too many. I think there were 18 comments on this, and then there were another 30 or so on the original post. So I'm going to pick the highlights and just talk about what's changed. So my original reaction to this, number one, if you're watching this on YouTube, obviously you're going to see the visuals, but if you're not, then I'll just try to describe them. So there's this equation for change, which is basically 6 points that says if you have vision, skills, incentive, resource, and action plan, if all those things are in place, you have successful change. And then each of the lines shows what an outcome is going to be based on one of those things missing. So for example, if you don't have vision, but you have all the rest, there'll be confusion. So change won't happen because there'll be confusion. If you're missing skills, there'll be anxiety because people don't know how to do the change. If you're missing incentive, this is the interesting part. It says there'll be gradual change. And I think all change works that way, but I'll say more about that in a minute. If resources are missing, and I'm guessing they mean people, not pens and desks, you end up with frustration. And then if you have no action plan, you end up with a false start. Now, when this diagram was originally floating around LinkedIn, it was just the diagram. There was no quote of source. So I didn't even know where it came from because the change equation, Beckard-Harris change equation, also uses the same phrase. So this change equation is from Mary Tippett, apparently. So I Googled a little bit to find out about the origin of that. So if you're confused about what is meant by the change equation, for this episode, it's about Mary's model. And interesting enough, both of those came out in 1987. So I would guess maybe there's some relationship there, or they knew of each other or something. But anyway, so my original thought was every time I would see this, I was like, really? An equation? Because the change management world loves steps. Here's the 8 steps for successful change. Here's this model that talks about the 5 things you must do to ensure change. Here's the equation that if you combine all these things, everything's just going to work out fine and everything is going to be good. We're kind of locked into this idea of seeing something and looking at it and going, that's giving me certainty in a world where I cannot have certainty. So it just generates this reaction of, yes, if we can just do that. So for me, these oversimplified things are a coping mechanism. They're a coping mechanism because we see them, we see what's happening in our organization, we don't like what's happening, we can't figure it out, we see this and we go, yes, I knew I was right and it's those people that are crazy. So maybe it does serve a good purpose of kind of giving us a way to blow off steam. But I saw it enough times where I finally went, oh, for crying out loud, somebody's got to talk about this thing. And it was sort of similar to the 70% stat that I mentioned way, way, way back when. And it turns out there's a bunch of change people. You know, Jen Frams talked about that, Heather Stagel, Rick Torben, a bunch of people have said it's just a big pile of BS. And it's put in place for change consultancy firms to scare you into buying their services. So 70% of changes fail, but if you use my stuff, 100% of them will be successful. So it was kind of the same reaction to this change equation. And I thought, well, yes, it's overly simplified. And my original thoughts around it was really just asking a bunch of questions about those different combinations. So sure, okay, let's go through all 6 of those things. The first one being vision. So my original thoughts were, what if the vision is wrong, full of buzzwords, or unclear? So I worked in one organization where their vision was to be the best public sector organization in Canada. Well, who doesn't want to be the best whatever in their industry? How is that helpful? And when you look at the Kennedy's moon statement, our vision is to send a person to the moon and bring them back to Earth safely. So everything is encompassed in that statement. That's a compelling thing that people can rally around. And my thoughts around this vision was, vision is sometimes it's a soundbite or it's a bullet point done by people at the top. And from my experience, the way those things are created is usually a change person saying, we need a vision statement. And then somebody goes away and they write a bunch of things down and they email, here's 5, just put one of those in the document. That sounds good. And maybe that's the cynic in me, but I've seen it numerous times. So we don't spend enough time because the people who are asking for the change, the vision's in their brain, right? Like my vision for lean change is something that's in my head. I have a very difficult time articulating. And if you really want to talk to Sarika, who's my colleague, and she's got to drag a lot of this stuff out of my head because it's there and it's sitting there, but it's difficult to put into a bullet point. Your vision is really, your entire approach and your thoughts, the things that consume your life. Like I'll wake up at 3 a.m. and I'll grab my phone and I'll go, oh, you should do a video about this because I think it would be valuable. The vision is, I want people to enjoy doing change work. And I want them to do things that are positive for themselves and the people around them. Nobody's going to buy a change framework if that's the vision statement. But anyway, the whole point about this vision thing is, how do we know it's right? It might just be full of a bunch of buzzwords. So even if we have it, how useful is it? The skill one being an interesting one because so many change agents I talk to, they talk about, tools, frameworks, whatever. Those are not important. So 100% of the change people that I talk to put tools at the bottom, yet everything on any of my websites, properties, videos, whatever, 100% of those people want templates and tools, which I find interesting. I think there's some cognitive dissonance going on there. But so skills is a difficult thing too, because who doesn't think they're sorry, that was a crazy way to say it. Who thinks they're an unskilled change agent? Who thinks they don't have the skill? Nobody. We all think we have skills. We all think we know what we need to move change forward. And for me, the 4 dimensions of change that we talk about, really, like skills is one teeny part of it. And your traits and your temperament is another part of how you use those skills. And one of the examples that I like to give is I went to this change conference. They wanted to do this innovative coffee chat session at the beginning. And I think some of you might have heard this story already. So they created the 4 topics. They assigned people to 4 parts of the building. And then there was a moderator who controlled the conversation. And for them, that was innovative. And for me, coming from the agile world and Lean Coffees, which was created by Jim Highsmith and Jim Benson, or open spaces where you'd walk into an empty conference room, there'd be paper on the floor, and they'd say, write your topics and organize your conference. That's co-creation. That's finding out from people what it is they want to talk about. So the skills part, anybody can run a Lean Coffee. Anybody can run an open space. It's an easy skill to develop, but it's your attitude and your traits and your temperaments towards doing that with your audience is the thing that matters more. And in that traditional change conference, I can't say what was going on for them, but I would assume they felt the need to control the way it happened, because if people didn't have a good experience, they've got a board to answer to, and the board is going to say, well, people didn't like it, therefore, head organizer, you're out on your butt. And I can't obviously say that's what happened, but the skills is just one tiny piece of that as well, because people can look at the instructions for running a lean coffee and do it completely wrong. They can look at an open space and they can do it completely wrong. And underneath, it's their fears and insecurities about letting go of that uncertain feeling that, kind of steers people into wanting to control something because they need to make sure it's a good outcome. The incentives one I'm going to leave to last, because that seemed to be the bulk of the comments on the on my post and some of the other ones as well. So the resources one, that's just an easy answer. And by resources, I'm assuming they don't mean pens and desks. That's if there's nobody working on the change, well, duh, what do you think is going to happen? Now, they probably mean dedicated people, a change coalition, which what Cotter talks about. So if there's nobody working on it, like, what do you think is going to happen? Of course. Action plan's the next one. That's an interesting one, too. It's just, you look at these things, and it's easy answer. It's just, sorry. Yes, it is frustrating. I'm looking at the screen if you're listening to this on the audio part. I'm looking at the one where we've got vision, skills, incentive, and action plan, but no resources, and that ends up in frustration. Well, of course, because somebody needs to be acting as the air traffic controller. So I like to use the air traffic controller metaphor, or the switchboard operator from back in the day when people would patch calls through. Somebody needs to be orchestrating and keeping sight of the big picture and sees all the moving parts and figures out how to link those moving parts together in real time so they can move one step forward. And the action plan missing. The outcome is false start, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. If there's no action plan, probably just nothing's going to happen. It doesn't mean you need a year-long plan and you need all these steps sorted out, but you need some minimum viable change approach that you can use to at least start taking some action. So my original thought was basically it's oversimplified it, and it's making us not think about this, because you are going to get change agents that say the change isn't working because we need a better action plan. And here's the 5-step framework for how do we create that action plan. And now I'm going to get to the incentive part. Incentives is hard. I mean, we do know that incentives work in repeatable non-knowledge work. And I won't say we know for certainty, but we do have more data today that incentives are not necessarily the right approach in knowledge work. And what I mean by that is, if you give people an incentive to do a complex change or a transformation, that change or transformation will get done. Nothing might be different. It might even be worse, but at least that person got their incentive. Because incentive programs are extremely difficult to get right. You've got people, I worked in a place, I was a change agent on a team, and our manager said, you need to log into PeopleSoft or whatever it is and put your objectives in there and create your 3 objectives based on what has been cascaded down from the top. And he said, here's my 3, just paste them in there because it doesn't matter. So I mean, there's a certain level of BS with all this and with all these incentives. And I think it's I learned this from Esther Derby at AYE, and she said, and Johanna Rothman, and I think they put this in one of their books that I'll put in the links to the description. It was Behind Closed Doors, which is probably one of the best management books out there. With the right incentive, a manager will take the company down if it means getting their incentive. And I did not say that, or I did not articulate that the right way, but it's basically give somebody an incentive, they will get that incentive, even if it means doing the wrong thing for the change or for the company, because that's just how it works. That's how we've been trained in the business world, is the carrot and stick method. Some of the comments now that I'll switch to. So first I'll start with some of mine, and Ron talks about this all the time, and I don't know if people are going to get mad, because if you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to see people's names in their comments, but that's not the intent. Ron's been talking about this forever, just the change world's need for oversimplification. and clickbait buzzwordy stuff. And that was kind of similar to his comment. We get way too hung up on models and methodologies. And I think that's true. And I think a reason for that is because it's easy. We can look at something on paper and go, yes, that aligns with my personal beliefs. Therefore, that is the thing that is true. And then anybody who doesn't think that is crazy. And that's straight out of Chris Argyris's playbook for the ladder of inference. And I think the other thing, like I mentioned earlier, is the change is 100% occupying 100% of the space in our brains, whereas it's 1%. I can't even say a percentage, but let's just say people who have day jobs and who are doing the work that are affected by the change, not even close to 100%. So we start looking at more models. We start looking at, well, what's a model or an idea or a framework that can help me figure out what this problem is, because sometimes we have to wait and see for change to happen, and we can't wait and see because we've got our boss who's on our back about, hey, what's happening with the change? Where's the status report and all that kind of stuff. So the interesting, if I flip to my blog post with some of the comments, so here, I'll hide his name just so you don't get mad at the dude. So somebody who completely disagrees with this perspective is, I think the above is ridiculous and flippant commentary. And actually, I said that in the post. I said, yes, of course I'm being flippant here. And the reason I'm being flippant is because change is too complex to distill into into 6 steps that have 6 ingredients each. And the combination of that, not even the permutations, the combinations of one missing, are the things that make change not work. So this person didn't agree. Can you split hairs and say the equation is imperfect? Sure. And my experience shows that this schematic is universally true at a macro level. Okay, good, awesome. Like, I don't really care either way. And then there's the opposite comments. I don't think anyone who practices change leadership believes these are equations to be followed or calculated. Oh, here's an old, yeah. I wrote this post 7 years ago. So yeah, somebody actually did do a comment and said this is from Mary Lippett. Other people posted different models. Here's another equation that some people had posted where they basically took that idea and then just added a few things to it as well. Of course, there's some spot-on comments. Astute and amazing. Ooh, I've never been called astute before. That's pretty good. And then, of course, the easy, I'm assuming this is an agile person. Fail fast should be the roadmap towards change. That's one of those nice, easy answers that comes from the agile world. The comments on the post. So the original post was from, it got a lot of views, 1,800 reactions, 46 comments, 236 reposts. Which, whenever I see things that have lots of shares and likes and comments, I know it's an easy answer, because I actually did an episode on that. I called it fluff and bullshit, because one of the clients I was working with a number of years ago, I hired a coach who I'm not going to mention, but you probably all know who this person is. And that's exactly what they said about our plan. So we were doing kind of quarterly A3 improvement things. And after, I think, 6 months, or the first 3 quarters, we had to plan for the next quarter, and that was his comment. It was, looks like a lot of fluff and bullshit. It's interesting, but not useful. And, combine that with this Why Business People Speak Like Idiots book. That was just like, yeah, you know what? Reading back through this, it is a bunch of BS and fluff and easy answers. How do we change that? So anyway, so the comments on here are everything from, hey, this rocks, or no, this is totally wrong, and everywhere in between. And then, of course, I got dragged in. So what about lean change management? And then I got tagged in that comment, and I was like, oh, great. Here we go again. I'm getting asked to comment on something, and when I comment on it, all the passive-aggressive articles from the other change experts are going to come out a week later, chastising me for saying things that are wrong. Because that's been a pattern too. Steve had an interesting one. People don't need incentives. They need interesting problems to solve and to feel appreciated. So that's, yeah, like confirmation bias going off in my brain. Definitely. And then another great comment here. What if 2 of those are lacking? So I would say, you know, the vast majority of these comments, or yeah, here, thank you, this post is amazing. That's what they were basically like. It was, you got the people on one side that are like, this is the greatest thing ever, and yes, yes, yes. And then there's other people like, wait a minute. What about this? What about that? What about the other? How do we apply this? So I'm pretty sure something created in 1987 works. Love this, people tagging each other. Amazing, amazing, let's share. Simple, very useful, clarity. So I wrote my post, I guess, 7 years ago. And somebody had asked when I put my comment on there around, yeah, I already got in trouble for talking about this 7 years ago and questioning the great change model that everybody loves. Somebody asked, well, what do you think about it now? So I'm going to close off with this because I do try to keep these episodes short, but this one feels like I'm rambling a little bit. So what do I think about it now? Well, managing complex change, first of all, having a title of something that says managing complex change and distilling it to a simplified model with a bunch of steps that create certainty shows a fundamental lack of understanding of complexity, especially in today's organizations. And even in today's organizations, I would say there's more awareness about how complex and interconnected things are in our organizations today, but it's always been that way. We just live in a world that all of this information is just blurted out at us constantly. So we think it's getting more complex when really is it really? Are things really more complex now than they used to be? Information flows faster, so maybe that creates more chaos. But as far as complexity, organizations have always been complex. I think now that we're just seeing the consequence of how we choose to deal with that complexity. But as far as these steps, it's sort of like, people always ask me about CODR and ADKAR as well, being the two probably more well-known ones. And anything that's linear and step-based, I don't think the intention is that they are linear and step-based. I see them more as a checklist of things that you should be aware of and pay attention to. So, ADKAR, especially if there's no awareness, if people don't know about the change won't happen. If they know about it and don't care about it, the change won't happen. And then knowledge, ability, and reinforcement, if those things don't exist, then the change won't happen. And that's another one of those, well, duh, of course. If nobody knows about the change, what do you expect them to do? If nobody gives a shit, what would you expect? But as far as 5 parameters or properties to pay attention to and how you create those things is valuable. But I don't agree they happen in a linear way. I don't think you create awareness and desire first and then move on to knowledge. And they do overlap in the ADKAR model as well. So I think people misinterpret it as being linear. I don't think that's the intention of it. But looking at those 5 things is important. Looking at the 8 steps for CODR are important, but they're not steps. They're 8 things that you should pay attention to. And I think my opinion of this is kind of the same. These are important things to pay attention to. So if we do have all 5 of those things, to quote this awesome Why Business People Speak Like Idiots book, let's double click on that. So is the vision useful? Is it the right vision? Are we using the vision to keep us pointed in the right direction, but we're putting in subtle course corrections as we go? Maybe the vision shifts a little bit over time. Skills. I already talked a little bit about skills in the beginning, but what are we doing? My last episode was about building change capability, and sometimes that gets lumped into skills. So we need to have change capability instilled in the managers and the leaders so they can become leaders for the change. And you can check out that episode. The links will be in the description as well. The incentives, I think I already talked about that, but my opinion is, I think, similar to what I had talked about originally. I think it would be a little more on the extreme side just because of social media, the amount of information that's bombarded with us, the focus on happiness, the focus on employee experience, those things that have shifted over time. Those, on the extreme negative end, it creates more separation between the people doing the work and the people at the top, because they're going to want to push these incentives down, and the people on the teams basically try to cope with those incentives. So they do the right thing despite those incentives, or they figure out workarounds so they can do the things that are meaningful and the things that matter, but still pushing the smoke and mirrors back up the stack so they can get their incentive. And I think we're slowly learning that the carrot stick method is not so much the best. And again, that depends on the organization and that depends on the market they're in. I'm sure there are some organizations where incentives are still valuable, and it's the norm. So I was doing some work with one of the banks that was merging East and West operations. They wanted their managers to become more coaches, but they weren't taking the commission away. They weren't dealing with the commission problem. So the managers were still incentivized to sell mortgages, but now they had to help other people do that as well. So where do you think they're going to spend their time? They're going to spend their time where their incentives are going. So now if you put an incentive, if you shifted that incentive where it became a collective we, and I've heard stories about this, but I haven't validated it, that apparently T-Mobile would do this, where they would have autonomous business units that when that entire unit did well, that unit got a bonus, and they figured out how to do that. Johanna Rothman told a story about this. I don't know if it's in Behind Closed Doors. She said she was working as a manager and she was given a basket of money. Here's the bonus and the incentive for your group. So you decide who gets what. And she brought it to the team. And long story short, I don't know how to solve this problem. What do y'all want to do with it? And I believe the result of that story was they gave a large chunk to one contributor that was known as being, that had contributed a lot to that particular time period, and then they split the rest of it evenly between people on the teams. So I think my stance on incentives has maybe softened a little bit depending on how they're implemented. But if you're talking traditional incentives, no, they don't work, because they're often disjointed and disconnected, and there's competing priorities. I was doing some work with one of the telecoms, and they were pushing prepaid devices. Now, all the money is in postpaid because that's the comeback, right? That's where you get people coming back every month and paying their monthly fees, and they're incentivized to make their business go up. But prepaid, there's a department in prepaid that they're not going to get their bonus unless they drive prepaid up. So you're trying to convert. Now, if the incentive was to convert prepaid to postpaid, maybe that would have worked. It's hard to say, but that's just an example of how there's traditional incentives are from my experience, put people in competition with each other, and they chase the incentive instead of chasing what's right for the company. The resources one, this has definitely shifted, because I think, especially this being from 1987, and if you look at Cotter and you look at all of the other change management methods, frameworks, and models, they talk about the change team, the importance of the change team. And there needs to be a dedicated change team or a dedicated resource who's pushing the change. And I think it's important, but I think it's different nowadays, where the change people are more facilitators, or in my view should be more change facilitators, not change managers. There's kind of this ego complex on a lot of these change thought leaders that talk about, here's how you as the change agent lead change. Well, you're not leading change. You're on the sidelines helping people lead change. You're not the change leader. Maybe the leadership part comes in your attitude and your behaviors. But as far as, a dedicated change team that sits here and pushes things out to people, and directs the change and controls the change and leads the change, I think that's less relevant now than it used to be, because there are more companies have flatter structures and hierarchies than they did before, and more people have more access to information about how to be change agents. So I think it's less relevant. I think the resources, for me, it just switches the stance of the actual change person. So they're less of a change manager, more of a change facilitator. And then action plan, another one of those, it's just dumb. Of course you need a plan. It doesn't mean you need a 50-page plan to do it. There's a couple of videos I'll put in the description as well about make your action plan the minimum viable action plan that's going to help you take one step forward this week in the context of your vision. So it's important to have an action plan. It's more important maybe to have a flexible action plan. So you are adjusting to information and what's happening with the change in real time. So I'm going to wrap this up now because this is getting much longer than I wanted. And if you're still listening, thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. This format is starting to take shape, like I mentioned. So every Sunday morning, I'm going to be able to get these episodes recorded. They're just live, off the cuff. And next week's topic is going to be around the 70% stat, which I can't believe I'm saying that again, because it's already been debunked numerous times. But I did get dragged into more conversations about what happens. How do you facilitate change when you know 70% of them fail? And my view is Bill Burr tells an awesome joke where he says, suppose you find out that 3 out of 4 parachutes don't open and your buddy wants to invite you to skydiving. Are you going to do it? No, you're probably not. So how useful is that? So you can check out that episode next week. So wrapping up this episode on the change equation, I'm in the camp that there's usefulness in all of these things to a certain degree, or maybe they're interesting to look at. They're interesting to have theoretical discussions about. Think about this. When it's Monday morning, 10 a.m., you've got a stakeholder update. Change isn't going well. They want to know what's going on. Are you going to go up and post this, in your presentation and say, we're missing a better action plan and that's why the change isn't going well? No. You're probably not going to do that. You're not going to pull out this model. You're not going to pull out any change model because no stakeholder on earth cares about the change framework and the model that you use. So my view is actually one of the things I'd recommend is read this book because, and that, again, that's why business people speak like idiots, because it gives you ideas to cut through the noise and the nonsense, because I think we as change agents owe it to people in the organization to be human and to be real and to be authentic and to look at change through a bunch of different lenses, but really come with that attitude that we're here to help. We're here to help facilitate the change. We're not here to hide things. We're here to make things as transparent as possible and acknowledge the fact that change is really difficult. And I think the more we can be real and the more we can be authentic and genuine and not put these overly simplified models, tools, and methods front and center, I think we're going to be more likely to help people get excited about change and help them really move things a step forward. So thanks very much for listening or watching. Drop your comments below. And again, I mentioned a bunch of things in this episode. You can find all those links at thatchangeshow.com in the show notes. And obviously you'll find them on Lean Change TV or on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to go refill my coffee now, go out for another walk or maybe a run. I love runs, but my knees don't. And that's it for this week. And I'll see you next week on That Change Show.